Good afternoon, or actually evening, as the case may be, wherever you are, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sylvia Mathewson, and in addition to serving as the Chief Operating Officer for SID-WOCA, I also have the privilege to serve as a board member of SID Washington. After yesterday's session with Andrew Herskowitz, I tried to convince my cats to join us, but I was wholly unsuccessful. So I hope we will still be somewhat entertaining, but more importantly, thought-provoking for all of you here today. I'm really excited about joining this session today. We have, of course, a very impressive array of panelists, and we're talking about an issue that is absolutely crucial in the world today. I'd like to very briefly frame the discussion before we start, but I want to make sure you hear the word discussion because I'm counting on hopefully our participants to join the discussion through the chat room. As David Miliband said yesterday, there was actually a crisis well before COVID. SDGs were not on track in many, many countries. And even before COVID, the world was facing, I think we would all agree, a dire food insecurity situation due to a range of factors. I mean, climate change, pest infestations, political crises, economic upheaval. And of course, then with the onset of COVID-19, food systems at all stages have been disrupted. Production, harvest, market, transport, and consumer purchasing, and of course, consumption. We know that as a result of this, we've got lower incomes, higher food prices, actually putting food out of reach for so many people, undermining the right to food and stalling SDG 2, zero hunger, possibly adding somewhere between 83 and 132 million people to the global total of undernourished in 2020. 2 billion people are currently experiencing hunger. And we already knew before that global food insecurity was rising since 2014, according to the State of the Food Security and Nutrition report this July. USAID's Jim Barnhart reminded us very recently that the projections we see today are daunting. And in fact, they're frightening, but projections aren't necessarily destiny. He and many others demand a call to action for those of us committed to eliminating food insecurity, hunger, malnutrition in all of its forms in our lifetimes. Our panelists today bring a discussion with a different lens each, but actually with very complementary views on where we are today and what innovative solutions we need in order to address this urgent worldwide crisis. So with that brief frame, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and to explain the lens through which they are looking at the crisis and responses to it. So Jocelyn, would you mind starting?
I would not mind, I'd be delighted to. So hello everybody, my name is Joanne Brownhall. I am the Deputy Regional Representative for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, as most of you know. I am based in Accra. I cover the 47 sub-Saharan countries that are under our regional office in Africa. And the lens through which I'm looking at this through is clearly at a international governmental level, international organizational level. One thing that struck me as I've been through this first crisis through FAO, this is my first time through a crisis with FAO, is the UNCT and how closely FAO is working with WHO and the United Nations Development Program and others to work with various ministries, not just the ministries of health, but agriculture, fisheries, gender, social protection, economy, trade, and how that UNCT is working together to support the COVID responses. So, of course, my focus is on agriculture, fisheries, food security, and forestry, natural resource management, but that's the lens through which we're working on it. Thank you. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you. And I know that SID-WOCA was privileged to have the opportunity to serve you and work for you while you were at USDA, and I'm really delighted to have you on the stage here, so thank you. Tracy, could you introduce yourself and let us know about the lens you're looking at this through today?
Yeah, hi, it's nice to meet everyone. My name is Tracy Mitchell. I'm the Senior Resilience and Food Security Advisor with RTI International, based in Washington, D.C. I'm an agriculturalist by education and am part of RTI's Food Security and Agriculture Division. Before relocating back to Washington, For about 15 plus years, I've been based overseas managing food security and economic development projects, mostly in East and Southern Africa. My last posting was as chief of party for a Food for Peace project in Karamoja, Uganda. At RTI, I lead their resilience practice. And the focus, our main focus over the past year has really been on the resilience of market systems and the resilience of market actors, and how that is really important for food security and vulnerable populations. So as you can guess, the lens that I'm going to be bringing to today's discussion is really around the impact of COVID on market actors and market systems, and why we should really care about that, and how that can be a critical piece of the recovery and going forward in terms of market system resilience. Thank you.
That's great, Tracy. You know, SID-WOCA, RTI, so many other organizations in today's session are really looking at adopting and pivoting our programs as we address COVID. And we're all looking at inclusive market systems that have always aimed to look at large systemic problems and find ways to make the markets work better for the poor and marginalized. And now they are needing to apply that systems approach to developing resiliencies for market actors. And so I'm really excited to have you share that perspective.
Thank you.
Mark, welcome. Could you introduce yourself?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Sylvia. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. My name's Mark Castellino, and I am the Vice President for Public Sector Business Development at Opportunity International. And I also serve as the co-chair of SID's Food Security and Agriculture Work Group. And I should give a quick plug to our work group and some of the great events that we've put on over the last couple of years, as well as what we've got coming up ahead. So please look on SID's website for events that we have coming up. We've got one in a couple of weeks' time. Opportunity International provides financial solutions to unleash the power of entrepreneurship. And we do this by partnering with financial service providers around the world to help them offer the right products and services, loans, savings, insurance, and training to meet the needs of people who are working their way out of poverty. We've been working in agriculture finance in Africa since 2008. And we support financing throughout the value chain, but we're particularly focused on production finance to smallholders, which is really the most underserved segment of the agriculture market system. So I come to this really important discussion from the perspective of access to finance. Finance is an enabler. It allows enterprises to achieve their business objectives. Finance is also a catalyst. It allows businesses to grow and creates additional opportunities for further investment. And finance is also a game changer. It has the ability to unlock markets and to disrupt industries. But on the flip side, where finance is not available, it stifles markets and it stifles innovation and it stifles growth. So I'm particularly interested in how finance and capital markets are being impacted by this pandemic and what the consequences are and could be on the agriculture sector, particularly in Africa.
Oh, that's excellent. And thank you for your leadership on that SID Food Security and Agriculture Working Group, also with my colleague Sabrina at SID-WOCA.
Absolutely.
I'm excited about that access to finance conversation, and I'm hoping we'll be able to delve into it, particularly as it relates to women. I mean, as we know, I know you're coming at from the lens from Africa, but in Latin America, less than 50% of all women have access to bank accounts, let alone access to finance for their businesses. And providing access to finance to women is a key to jumpstarting economies and building resilient households in the future. So I hope that'll be part of what we can address in this important conversation. And Lori, welcome.
Thanks very much, Sylvia. It's really a great pleasure to be here today and join all of you on this really obviously very timely and critical conversation on the impacts of COVID-19 on food security and hunger for people around the world. The lens that I'll bring to this conversation is the lens of my work in this space over the past 8 years as the Director of Global Food Security and Foreign Aid Effectiveness at the Lugar Center. My background comes in the policy space. I spent more than 20 years on Capitol Hill. I worked in the House and the Senate. I worked in the majority and the minority. I worked for an authorizing committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under Senator Lugar. And I also worked in the House for someone who chaired an appropriations subcommittee known as a cardinal. And so I'll bring the perspective of US leadership and policy in this space, especially the role of Congress in working with the executive branch to help lead us out of this current situation, both here in the US and of course around the world.
Great, excellent. I think it's going to be a great conversation, clearly from many different but equally important perspectives. So I think, as everybody here knows, David Beasley is Executive Director of the World Food Program, said, if we don't prepare and act now to secure access, avoid funding shortfalls and disruptions to trade, we could be facing multiple famines of biblical proportions. I think many of us have heard and seen that quote. We know that the ongoing COVID pandemic has posed enormous challenges to all of us and all of those who are working in food security towards zero hunger. And the effects of the pandemic, however, on food security will persist past the pandemic quite significantly, compounded by job losses and economic slowdowns. Frankly, I think we can assume limiting food access for years to come. We've got some immediate issues we need to be dealing with, but I think we'll also be needing to talk about the long term. So, what I think I'd like to delve into is to get kind of each of your take about where we are at this point in time, the current state of affairs, what has been going on, and what has put food security in such great peril. So Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you to start again, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I'm happy to. So as you noted, and I'm just listening to you talk about it, it feels overwhelming, the numbers. 2 billion people experience hunger. We've seen a 20% uptick of people who are experiencing acute food insecurity. We started the COVID pandemic at not a great place for food insecurity, and it's gotten worse. And there's some other issues going on, such as conflicts throughout Africa and Middle East. There's some locusts, some desert locust pestilence going on in East Africa. And then there's a story that has not received a lot of attention around African migratory locusts and red locusts, also in Southern Africa. And then we have climate change issues. I mean, so the list goes on. And then on top of all of this, we have the issue around the youth population, the underemployed youth population, especially in Africa, as well as gender inequality. So it can feel very overwhelming and very daunting. And I applaud the executive director for ringing the bell over food insecurity, because as our focus has been on COVID, I think we've lost the plot a little bit on that. And those of us who work deeply in the food security realm, probably the second we heard about COVID, the second thing we thought about was, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to, how is this going to affect us all on food security and water security for that matter, and nutrition security. So as I pile on that list, and it can feel overwhelming. We in FAO have our goal is to work with governments and ministries to sort of address all of this this mountain of information and sort through it, and also to gather the information, which, as you know, in many developing countries is a struggle, not just on COVID numbers, but on food insecurity numbers. A country that I represent in FAO is Ghana, and the last time that Ghana has done a food insecurity and vulnerability assessment was 2009. So the data at our fingertips is not as great as it could be. There are 7 areas that FAO is trying to work with governments on. I won't do them in order because as soon as I remember 6th, I can't remember the 7th, but they focus, of course, on social protection, ensuring that government stepped up to the plate on social protection. You've mentioned trade. I'm so glad you mentioned that. We have to keep the trade borders going open, because not every country, nor should every country, be food self-sufficient. And I think we get tangled up in some of those conversations conversations about food security versus food self-sufficiency. We have issues around One Health, which I want to bring forward. Let's not forget COVID is a zoonosis. It was started as an animal disease and it jumped to human diseases. The veterinarians that I work with try to remind me all the time that most human diseases, or about 70% of human diseases, come from animals. And I think we've lost the plot a little bit on that. We also want to talk about resilience, ensuring that those persons that before the disease were, who were sort of getting out of being on the edge, don't fall back into those edge. Of course, I want to, I'm sure others on this call have already talked about food systems disruptions. We want to make sure that there's the flow of goods, not only across the trade, across trade borders, but within the country. And we've seen in our own developed countries, I think the vice president candidate last night talked about a run on toilet paper. So we've seen food supply disruptions and also supply disruptions that are important to just our sanitation. And then we also want to make sure that we get that good data, and FAO has been working with countries in terms of trying to make sure that we have a good sense of what's going on. I know my time is short. If I could add to the point about sort of 7 ideas or 7 buckets in which we're addressing food insecurity, I think another point that I want to make sure that people come away with is we are just seeing the beginnings of the impacts of the food insecurity situation if the status quo doesn't change. This is the harvest time for Southern Africa. This is the planting time around the world for other countries. Wheat, for example, winter wheat will start getting planted in the United States. And so there's going to be this time lag in terms of we don't really know what's going to happen with food availability in the next harvest time. We do know that right now, the greatest crisis in food security is around access, with the millions of people who have lost their jobs, with the small businesses that have been shut down, with the informal markets, particularly in the developing world, that have experienced, sort of fatal blows to several small and medium enterprises. That right now is the attention that we're working on. Fortunately, our data shows us that there hasn't been a run on food prices, but of course, availability and supply and demand will dictate a lot of that. And we need to ensure that governments keep the markets open and don't intervene on food prices to manipulate them, because we've seen that movie before in 2008, and we can see that the destruction that it can wreak. So there's a lot more to be said, but I think those are the high points that I want to touch on, and hopefully I can learn more from my colleagues here. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to jump in at this point? I know the market system piece is crucial.
Yeah, I would love to. I want to build on the point that Jocelyn made about so far the impact has really been around people's access to products, more so than availability, but sort of looming on the horizon is the forecast about, how our current situation could transform into limited availability or disruptions in terms of availability of food products. And so I just want to build on that a little bit. While some market actors have been able to adapt to COVID, for example, some of RTI's recent research in Senegal shows that farmer groups have been able to very proactively step up and help their members renegotiate credit terms, supply contracts, so that they were able to get paid for their most recent production. Other farmers weren't as fortunate and actually missed a selling season or had to sell their products for a lower price. And so this is the beginning of what's going to really take us from being in an access crisis to an availability crisis, because those farmers won't be able to produce the same way they did last year. And then when we sort of broaden our perspective even further and look at the whole agricultural market system that underpins those farmers, looking at small businesses that distribute agricultural inputs like seed and fertilizer, or traders that purchase and export crops or livestock, many have had to reduce their operations during COVID or stop their businesses entirely. An assessment, a USAID project we implement in Somalia recently, just showed that 54% of the businesses reduced their operations and 33% stopped their operations entirely, at least temporarily. And the key challenges that they faced for why they had to take those actions really fell into two categories. And I think these are two categories that are going to be central as we look at recovery and bouncing back and next steps. The first category was really around reduced access to markets for those businesses. For example, they weren't able to access the inputs to sell, or they weren't able to sell things because of limited demand. The second category was around insufficient cash. And this was, for example, they didn't have the cash to pay their employees. And so they had to shut down, or they didn't have the cash to purchase inventory. So they shut down or reduced operations, or they didn't have the cash to repay their loans. Agriculture usually operates on annual or shorter term operating loans. And when you don't repay one loan, you can't get a new loan for the next year. And so this is what's really driving a lot of the changes based on the assessments that we've done over the past really 3 months. And this is going to surely certainly impact the availability of agricultural products. When farmers have less access to credit, inputs, or buyers, the net effect of that is that production and productivity both decrease. And so not only will the agricultural sector be less motivated or less able to produce or try to produce what they produced before in terms of acreage or hectares, if they don't have access to the improved inputs to do that, the productivity, it will drop. So going forward, we'll also likely see already thin markets become even thinner. And by that, I mean that there will be fewer businesses to provide services and less competition. So where farmers used to have access to 2 or 3 options to purchase their inputs, or 2 or 3 traders to sell their outputs, now there may be just one, because some of them have had to drop out of the market. I think we've all seen what this lack of competition means in terms of price gouging, quality of service, and overall value addition to the agricultural sector. We are seeing some implementers doing really innovative things. This is uncharted territory, and so I think it's good to sort of highlight what we've seen some people doing. I think the jury is still out in terms of what is actually working and what is not working. But some of the things we've seen focus on is stimulating local production through subsidized inputs, emergency loans, in recognition that imported food may not be as available in the coming year, or as a way to continue exports for foreign earnings. Other programs are directly addressing trade issues, for example, helping identify alternative markets or facilitating online sales of products. While others are taking, I think, a pretty interesting approach to really start looking more at localized markets, so that products that are produced in one area will be stored, processed, and sold and consumed in that same localized area. We have gotten into such long value chains and long supply chains over the past decades. And so seeing this sort of pivot, I don't know how far we need to pivot, but we can see that this makes sense, at least in the short term, with this alternative programming. But going forward, it's also going to be really important for us to start looking at the different market actors and market systems and seeing which ones are faring better than others in this crisis, and what kinds of resilience capacities are at the root of those successes or failures. For example, in Honduras, we've seen that businesses that were able to adapt their business model to use online sales instead of in-person sales have actually fared fairly well. And that says something about maybe the technology of that, but also the overall adaptability and openness to adaptation and learning for businesses. And so I have a feeling as we go forward, we may be looking more at what seem like more ambiguous things like openness to adapt instead of specific technologies and technical solutions, which is really the crux of a market systems approach. And so I'll stop there, but that's what we've been seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that quick pivot to new technologies and new ways of doing things, I don't think we could have ever envisioned a year ago what was even possible. So while we hear about, the Gates Foundation saying in 25 years of progress was erased in 25 weeks, you can still turn that around, and you can turn that pivot to say, when we start really analyzing more and more what we have done and how quickly we've there are some places, I think a lot of people thought that parts of Africa were going to be severely affected by the disease. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't impacted by other things, but what we expected to happen with remittances, for example, in very early on, some of those predictions didn't turn out to be the case at all. So it will be interesting to see how this technology can help change and continue to pivot. So with that, Mark, I'm really excited about the access to finance piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sylvia, you mentioned earlier the observation from David Miliband yesterday that we already entered this pandemic with kind of a number of crises, and we certainly see that in the finance space. In the most recent State of the Sector report by the Initiative for Smallholder Finance, they identified that there is a $240 billion demand for financing in rural areas. And only about 70 billion of that is currently being met. And so that leaves about a 70% gap, an unmet demand for smallholder finance. And that's how we entered this pandemic. And now we're seeing, as economies slow down or move into recession or deepen in recession, we expect to see a tightening in finance globally across all sectors. And we expect that tightening to be particularly pronounced in agriculture. The perception of risk in agriculture is kind of clearly there, and we expect to see investors kind of move into perceived less risky sectors. And so we anticipate that at the macro level, there is going to be less financing available for agriculture, and particularly for smallholder agriculture. So that's kind of like at the macro level. Sylvia, you also kind of mentioned, we're looking at two crises here, the public health crisis and the economic crisis. And we've kind of seen in Africa that the public health crisis has not been as pronounced as we expected it to be. And there's an argument over whether it's too early to make those kinds of predictions, but it's probably fair to say that there are some conditions in Africa that make it likely that the public health impacts will be milder than in other parts of the world. Lower levels of urbanization, lower population density, and fairly limited international travel, particularly business travel versus tourism. So there are some conditions there that would suggest that the public health crisis will be less of an issue, but the conditions for the economic crisis seem to be less favorable. For example, fewer financial resources are available for governments across Africa to respond to this crisis. There are fewer tools available to policymakers, both on the monetary and the fiscal side. We see less mature institutions in a lot of the countries that we're working in, such as central banks that lack the experience to manage these kinds of shocks, particularly given that in many of the countries we're working in, we've come off of multiple years of growth where they haven't had to deal with a contraction in the economy. And we also see kind of limited capacity of financial institutions to manage risk. When it comes to agriculture, there's very little risk-adjusted pricing that financial institutions are offering. So we see that the economic impact could be particularly pronounced. So what's been the immediate response? Many central banks declared imposing repayment moratoria on loans. However, in most cases, this wasn't made mandatory, and no central banks in the countries that we work in provided any support to financial institutions about how they could actually deal with the impacts of delaying repayment. So banks essentially had to work it out for themselves. It's really important to note that responsible financial institutions don't want their clients to default. So they're interested in looking at how they can make these loans work. And our financial institution partner in Uganda is a good example of that. To date, they've rescheduled the repayment on several hundred of their SME loans, essentially providing clients with extended repayment periods. But one result of this rescheduling of financing is that we have not likely seen the full impact of the pandemic on the economy yet. And so there's potentially going to be a kind of delay in the impact there. Also, on the impact on lending and portfolio performance, SME finance has been particularly affected, and we've seen examples of agribusinesses failing. I think Tracy touched on this a little bit in her comments. We've done a study with the University of Bath in Ghana where we found that a lot of our producers were saying when they go to market, the buyers aren't there. So at the aggregation level, at the transportation level, we've seen a much more immediate impact on this. On the positive side, though, we've seen much less impact on production finance. And so in Uganda, for example, our group borrowers, who are typically cooperatives or producer groups, actually chose not to delay their repayment. And this kind of goes to a really critical point that Jocelyn brought up about agriculture being a cyclical activity. So the growing seasons don't stop just because the virus is here. And so if farmers don't get the inputs and services that they need on time, then they run the risk of seeing major impacts on food availability and incomes in the future. So they're very interested in repaying their existing loans so that they can move into the next agricultural cycle. I want to quickly end with a few promising approaches that we've seen. One is financial institution capacity building. The capacity of the financial institution really makes a difference on how they've coped with this. And we've seen in a couple of our financial institutions that they've actually been able to grow their portfolio year on year. And it's because they were able to respond and assess the risks involved in lending and then continue their lending quite quickly. Another is digital finance. We've seen a massive demand for looking at ways that we can provide services to people without them having to come into physical branch locations, and that's obviously going to help in a time like this. And increasing liquidity is a considerable issue. The IFC, FAO and others I know have done some really interesting things around increasing liquidity for financial institutions, which is really critical. And the last one I'll mention is localization. One of the biggest challenges to food systems has been around distribution. And so if we can look at ways of incentivizing local farming systems, that can make a real difference, I think. So I'll end my comments here, but I look forward to discussing these topics in a bit more detail as we go into the rest of this panel.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Lori, your turn.
Yes, great. Thank you all for all of this fabulous sort of setting the table, if you will. And I just want to take just a moment to reflect about how we got to the current situation that we're able to talk about access to seeds and finance and the ability to use data and other kinds of technologies to help smallholder farmers brace for this current crisis and hopefully come through strong on the other side. And it was almost 10 years ago that the Obama administration saw the need to really strengthen U.S. leadership in global food security and establish the Feed the Future program. And a few years after that, Congress got in the game, not just with providing the annual funding for the Feed the Future program, but also in providing a partnership in the policy of global food security and U.S. leadership in this space. That has resulted in nearly 10 years now of an annual funding amount of $1 billion, investing in the infrastructure of Feed the Future countries around the globe, where we could really help to lay the structure to begin to help smallholders really access seed, develop value chains, help to move through their own products through those value chains, et cetera. And I think it's a really important time for us to reflect on where we would be if those kinds of leadership activities and commitment to the funding and support and partnership with these countries. And granted, it's sadly not every country in the world with smallholder farmers, but it was an important first 19 or in the end 18 countries where we laid the groundwork for this. And so that is really exciting that we were able to put those kind of building blocks in place. This is not to say we don't still have a long way to go. And that brings me to the next point. From there, the Trump administration has, under Ambassador Green at USAID, embarked on a really strong sort of reinventing of development assistance for the 21st century that was called Transformation. It was a multi-month process where everyone who wanted a voice, both internally to USAID and externally, could play a role in what a really fine-tuned development agency would look like. And I think it's really exciting and also helped to set the stage for supporting our partner countries through this crisis when we brought together several bureaus under one new associate administrator so that both humanitarian assistance as well as food security and resilience all came together. And we talked about prevention as well and conflict stabilization. So these kinds of policy directions, I think, are helping us to have a more comprehensive approach through the crisis too. There's much more to build on, and we'll talk about that in the next segment, but I wanted to stop there or wanted to lay those two pieces out because I think they're really important, and nothing is perfect, and none of us was fully prepared for this kind of crisis when we all have been wanting to quote David Miliband from yesterday about we were in a crisis already, and this is really tough stuff. So we're still building it together in U.S. leadership.
Great, thank you. Those are really, really important points, and it's really good to see what the building blocks are, what we have done in the past. We've said that the predictions are frightening, but those predictions don't have to be our destiny. So maybe we can take a quick step forward and talk about maybe innovative solutions that we need to put into place to address this problem. And, in September, David Beasley said that, the global hunger crisis is moving into a new and dangerous phase as famine is looming, and we have to step up, not step back. And he actually said that, quite frankly, 2021 will be a make or break year. So that's the short or medium term, but we also need to be looking at the long term. So what do you see needs to be done in an actionable manner to address the medium and long term as we move forward? So what do we need to do going forward, I guess, is the question. And Jocelyn, maybe you could jump in on that.
Happy to do so. Thank you. The problem is an old one. Food security has dogged us for millennia, right? And I think if we stick to the solutions that we know work, we talked about making sure that there's social safety nets in place, which many governments don't have the funds for, but I think that's an area where development partners need to focus on access to finance. One Health, I'll just say that again, we don't really know bat patient zero on this one, or if it came from a bat, and we still need to figure out how to contain some of those diseases. Open trade, I'll say that again, and all of the animal and plant health systems needed to make that trade flow, and the infrastructure development. So there's not really rocket science here. It's, I think we have established pathways, and I agree with Lori that the Feed the Future and the other call to other nations through the L'Aquila event and GAFSP and others have really put food security on the radar screen. But it's now a question of it's sort of an eat your spinach time of just plowing through some of these things, market information systems, animal and plant health systems that are not as, they don't make the greatest photo ops, but they are the building blocks. And we heard about from Mark about capacity building in financial institutions. I mean, I think we've got the solutions. We know what to do. It's a question of political will, and it's also a question of partners such as ourselves sitting here working together, coordinating our responses, not duplicating our efforts, and finding our niches. And I think in the UN area, we feel like our niche is in with government, government strengthening and capacity building, and ensuring that we're guiding and giving our best advice to ministries, and letting NGOs and private sector institutions do what they do best, which is move food or build up civil society organizations and a whole array of other things. So I guess I would just say is stick to our knitting and stick to the proven pathways forward. It's not, we don't need, there's no silver bullet here. Thank you.
No, that's really interesting. And it's interesting that you come from it, both from an understanding of what the US government has done and those building blocks that Lori spoke about, as well as also the UN system. But, the Committee on World Food Security really has a call for measures to improve food systems, to make them resilient to crises, equitable, inclusive, empowering, respectful, regenerative, healthy, nutritious, as well as, of course, productive and prosperous. But there seems to be a lack of international policy coordination on COVID's impact on food security, at least according to some. Maybe that's not your perspective. I'm wondering what your perspective is in terms of that, because pulling it all together does require some of that coordination. Are you seeing that or not?
I would say we are, and FAO has done a lot of work regionally trying to pull together ministers of not just agriculture, but fisheries, marine resources, water, climate, and we actually have a major conference coming up at the end of this month to address the COVID impacts. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work also done with the African Union, and the fact that you might not have heard that is just a clarion call for FAO to do more pushing out of the areas that we are working on and making sure that the public is aware of that coordination role we're serving. Thank you.
Excellent. That's excellent. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Tracy, did you want to just jump in on innovative approaches going forward? I mean, you did some already with your speaking, but there might be others that you consider.
Yeah, I think from an implementer's viewpoint, there are two things that that we can really look at. Coincidentally, USAID released a resilience guidance paper last year, and they also released a framework for measuring market systems resilience last year. And those two things, I think, had been developed, over some period of time. But it's really timely that we have them as tools to use now. And so I think it's really important in terms of the resilience guidance that USAID released. That's really a tool for projects to use. So many projects are economic development or agricultural productivity, as their main objectives. And, I think a lot of people are still having a hard time getting their head around, well, what is resilience programming, and how do are we already doing resilience programming, or what is resilience, what isn't? And going through that USAID guidance, it's really a great tool to help programs that are working at the market system or market level to assess what they're doing, to say, okay, out of all of these market system or market activities that we're doing, which ones what are the essential market functions that these markets are providing to vulnerable people, whether it's smallholder farmers, whether it's the workforce, whether it's consumers, to really map that out, and so that we can have a better informed and more targeted pivots in our programming going forward. The second document that USAID put out last year was the Market Systems Resilience Framework, which was a framework for measuring market systems resilience. That also is a great tool for us to begin using to really assess the resilience of the markets where we work, so that we can prioritize the weak areas and not waste our efforts in areas that really don't need it. I think becoming better at prioritizing using these tools is really a gift for our programs at this time, because we just don't have the resources to do everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Those rapid assessments in particular, I've seen a lot of programs pivot towards that around the world. And I think it goes a little bit to the question that we have in the chat box about, how are we making sure we're hitting the most vulnerable and the hardest hit in remote areas, is that in order to do what we need to do well, we need the facts, we need the numbers, we need to know what's going on, and we need to use those tools because otherwise we're just going to be doing things we did in the past, which might not actually have the impacts that we need in this crisis. So, great. Mark, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just on that question of how how we're reaching some of the most excluded, I think this kind of brings me to the topic of digital financial services, because when we started developing kind of digital approaches to finance, it was very much driven around this kind of financial inclusion issue. And it was, how can we get financing to the most underserved populations, whether that be women who traditionally have not had the same access to finance as men, or whether that's to more rural populations. And so, we've developed a whole suite of ways to deliver finance remotely, whether that's mobile banking or interactive voice response, where people can use the telephone if they've got low literacy levels. And it really helped us to deliver financing to more and more people. But it's been ideal now in this environment where we're able to use these same technologies to reach people who, now with social distancing and concerns about providing our traditional brick and mortar services, we're able to continue offering financial services to people remotely. And we're also kind of taking that the next step further. We've been doing a lot of work around developing digital mechanisms for farmer training. And so we've been working with pushing information to farmers through SMS or WhatsApp groups, which have been, if you're a farmer in Africa, then you probably, even in the most rural areas, have access to a phone where you can get WhatsApp messages. And so the ability to provide information remotely for people to access services remotely, I think is really crucial in this response.
I just wanted to bring it back to an earlier comment that, we know that crises like these impact women and girls around the world, and of course other vulnerable groups. I mean, I think that by this time next year, some people believe we could have 435 million women and girls living on less than $1.90 a day, and including 47 million specifically impoverished because of COVID. So I'm just curious if there's a gender lens you could put on that access to finance, and what can we do to make sure that in particular we can reach out to women in need and girls.
Yeah, I would say, continuing to look at how we can innovate the delivery of our services that can particularly target those most vulnerable groups, particularly women and girls who traditionally have not had access to finance in the same way. One of the things that we've been doing in our work is looking at smallholder agriculture as a family business, using the farming as a family business methodology, where we recognize that there are the entire family is engaged in that agricultural activity, which allows maybe not just the head of household, the man, to be able to access the financial service, but also the women, also young people in that household who will eventually become breadwinners themselves and need to have access to these kinds of financial services to allow them to succeed in the future. So we're kind of looking at how we can provide these services across the board, and particularly to communities that have been underserved.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes remaining, so maybe Lori, from the big policy perspective, you can kind of wrap up your thoughts about what do you think we can be doing to move forward and move the needle in this crisis.
Yes, great. Thank you. I have 4 points, and I'll try to be very quick with them. And several of you have touched on them, so that kind of makes me feel good that in the policy space, we're thinking about the right kinds of things. One of them is, first of all, really take a look at what we already had in place. Take a deep breath and assess what helped us get to the good places we are, whether it's making sure the smallholder had access to finance or a somewhat stable new market that they were able to keep moving through the crisis. What needs to be done a little differently or tweaking within a system, whether it's Feed the Future or one of the other programs that help to support smallholder farmers and farmers across the spectrum in this regard. Number 2, especially before I leave that, resilience, especially Tracy talked about that. I think that the agency is working well on trying to build on resilience, but I think they still have a long way to go. So this is a great opportunity to really dig deep and try to have a real impact in that space. Number 2, several of you talked about local and localization. One of the things we definitely have learned in sort of the aid effectiveness space in which I work during this crisis is that being an NGO from thousands of miles away isn't going to help in this crisis. Everybody was locked down, and it really was about the individual helping him or herself and their communities through the crisis. And in order to strengthen that localization component, we really need to focus on that capacity building piece. That definitely needs to be strengthened going forward. USAID had already begun to work on that, and it's an exciting place that they now recognize really needs some extra detail. 3, on something Jocelyn touched on, we coincidentally many months ago at the Lugar Center started a new project called the need for a 21st century green revolution. And we talked about the need for really digging in with R&D funding in agriculture. We actually even put out a product on pests and diseases and how, this is a borderless world where pests and diseases clearly don't know borders. And we are living that right now in COVID-19. So the role of U.S. leadership in investing in R&D is really critical, especially as Jocelyn pointed out, 70% of human diseases come from animals right now, and we need to really double down on this. Also in the ag space, the disease of, or the pest that Jocelyn mentioned too, the locusts in East Africa. I mean, there's just so many reasons to really commit to sustained research and development funding going forward, despite the challenges on the U.S. budget. And there clearly are many as we see Congress and the administration negotiating these challenging budgets. And finally, preparedness. Congress recently passed the Global Fragility Act to look at fragile countries where there already are these long-term, very entrenched humanitarian crises going on. After we are beyond COVID-19 and we have hopefully a vaccine and we're getting back to some great economic rebuilding, et cetera, we will still have these crises that we need to really help put together the planning in a comprehensive way, where we need to do preparedness planning on pandemics, but also on looking at these crises that are really draining our systems and even our people over multiple years. I'll stop at that.
Well, we've had a great discussion. I don't want to let people be late to the final plenary because I think it's going to be a very important discussion. I want to thank each and every one of you. I have learned an enormous amount, and I hope that we will continue this conversation once the live conference is over. And I really want to virtually give you an applause, which is what we would do if we were all together. So thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you all in the plenary. Thank you.